During the Peloponnesian War, the island of Corcyra was engulfed by a civil war. To the Greeks, this was a stasis, a word used for a party or faction promoting a cause, and by extension for the dispute over the cause itself. It was used especially when a conflict erupted beyond normal political activity to plotting and violence within a community. Why do civil wars start? There's no single answer to that question, but there are patterns that appear over time that we can study. For Thucydides, historian of the Peloponnesian War, conflicts between citizens of the same state and conflicts between states were tightly connected. Disputes which had a local origin would often acquire an interstate dimension and vice versa. So despite the value placed on independence in the ancient city-state, from the 5th and the 4th centuries BCE, Sparta and Athens were able to extend their influence to their respective allies by installing their own factions locally. From the time of Thucydides onwards, there was a tendency for these local factions to represent themselves as champions of some outside force, of the different political constituencies of their day, the rich or the poor, or of the oligarchic Spartans or the democratic Athenians. Thucydides had strong opinions about both types of conflicts, both those between cities and those between citizens within an individual city. From his history, we can extract the opinion, though it is important to note that he does not actually state it explicitly, that on the one hand, for individuals inside the state, there are laws which are enforced by sanctions. These laws may, hopefully, enable the weak to stand up to the strong from a position of approximate equality, and where ordinary ethical considerations can apply. On the other hand, with the relations between states, it is the strong alone who decide how they will treat the weak, and here moral judgments are virtually inapplicable. The 4th century orator Demosthenes, who was an enthusiastic student of Thucydides, tells us that force is the sole arbiter in international affairs precisely because of the impossibility of enforcing law by effective sanctions, for these exist only within the state. Now within states there are nomoi, which are laws and customs, and these put the weak on an equality with the strong and enable them to deal with each other on equal terms. In international disputes, interstate disputes entois hellenikos dikaios, the strong simply coerce the weak. Whatever the allegiance of each faction within the city, the dynamics of international and civil wars are fundamentally different. So what principles did Thucydides think should govern life within the city? And what happens when those principles dissolve? What happens when they're not present? What happens when they completely disappear? Corcyra was a city-state on the island of Corfu, Corcyra. In 427 BCE, during the Peloponnesian War, there was a revolution and a civil war, a stasis, in Corcyra between the democrats, who wished to remain in alliance with Athens, and the aristocrats, who wished to form an alliance with Corinth and Sparta. After a period of violent skirmishes, the democrats won with the assistance of the Athenian navy, and subsequently slaughtered those they suspected of being an enemy while the rest fled to the Greek mainland. Thucydides tells us that these sorts of situations flow from human nature, from certain immutable laws of humanity, but that the actual instance, the actual phenomena, would change according to circumstances. Corcyra was itself both the first and the worst of the stases in the Peloponnesian War. The general circumstances of the war itself exacerbated the situation. It created a kinesis of movement, disturbance, or convulsion in the city. The sufferings which revolution entails upon the cities are many and terrible. These have occurred in the past and always will occur in the future as long as the nature of mankind remains the same. These can occur in a severer or milder form and vary in their symptoms according to the variety of the particular cases. In peace and prosperity, states and individuals have better sentiments because they do not find themselves suddenly confronted with powerful necessities. But war takes away the easy supply of wants and desires, and so proves a rough master. This rough master brings most men's characters to a level with their fortunes. Thucydides then describes a certain psychological change which was brought about at Corcyra by the stasis. This change was characteristic of all intercommunity conflicts and constituted an identifying trait of civil war. It was a change in the meanings of words and the values that they represented. They exchanged their usual verbal evaluations of actions for new ones. Unreasoning boldness is now called loyal manliness, and provident delay is called cowardice concealed under a fair name. Moderation was believed to be a cloak for unmanliness, the ability to see all sides of a question, the inability to act on anything. Frantic violence became the attribute of manliness, prolonged deliberation a plausible excuse for avoiding any kind of action. The advocate of extreme measures was always trustworthy. His opponent was a subverter of his party. To succeed in a plot was to be intelligent. To figure out a plot was to be smarter still. But to try to avoid having to do either of these things was to break up your party and to be afraid of your opponents. In sum, to catch a criminal and to suggest the idea of a crime where there was no crime before was equally commended. This passage has been called a description of a transvaluation of values, and is similar to the newspeak we find in Orwell's 1984. The newspeak is a controlled language of simplified grammar and restricted vocabulary designed to limit an individual's ability to think and articulate subversive concepts such as personal identity, self-expression, and free will. As Orwell says, when the general atmosphere is bad, language must suffer. I should expect to find that the German, Russian, and Italian languages have all deteriorated in the last 10 to 15 years as a result of the dictatorships. But if thought corrupts language, language can also corrupt thought. Thucydides' actual opinions about these pre- and post-Civil War values are not exactly straightforward. For example, you might expect him to associate all of the pre-Civil War values, all of the positive values, with his native Athenians, but this is definitely not the case. Moderation, or sophrosyne, one of his most lauded values, is certainly a Spartan characteristic. Although Thucydides' moral and ethical sympathies might lie with the oligarchic Spartans, he certainly did not think that oligarchs were any less likely to start a civil war. When describing the state of mind of the oligarchic faction which took over Athens in 411 BCE, he says, "They professed to be interested in equality, but the truth was that most of them were given up to private ambition of the sort which is more fatal than anything to an oligarchy. For the instant an oligarchy is established on the concept of mere equality, everybody thinks that he ought to be far above everybody else." Civil wars rarely spark in a country with a stable autocratic or democratic government. It usually is in a transitory middle ground when a country moves from one to the other where civil wars are likely to start. What most of us understand civil wars to be is usually far off base. It's almost certainly not going to be a clash of organized armies in monochromatic uniforms arrayed neatly along geopolitical or geographical lines. Thucydides' narrative of the Stasis of Corcyra reveals an insidious threat driven by multiple psychologies. Alright everybody, that's it. I hope you enjoyed that. If you found this video entertaining or informative in any way, please do like and subscribe. It would help out the channel a lot. And I'll see you in the next one. Thank you very much.